Welcome to one of our Sunlight webinars. This particular webinar is to test or not to test, and we're going to talk a little bit about the value and different aspects of testing. First of all, let us introduce ourselves. My name is Judy, and you can see my bio there in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. I'm part of this awesome team that gets together periodically to create webinars for our customers and folks who are interested in Sunlight. Ladies, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourselves?
Well, my name's Jill. I'm in the upper right, and I used Sunlight for 10 years with my children until they graduated. My youngest one graduated from high school in 2007, and I work for Sunlight doing webinars, and also I do some homeschool conventions where I'm the one in the booth. If you go to one in like Ohio and Kentucky and some of those places, I'm also a Sunlight moderator, and I'm glad to be here today, Judy.
And I'm Kelly. I'm on the left-hand side of the screen. I'm what I call a graduated homeschool mom, with my youngest graduating in 2009. And we use Sunlight for over 12 years. But I enjoy talking to people about it and sharing in these webinar experiences.
Great. Well, thanks, ladies. I appreciate your willingness to get together today. So let's talk a little bit about this whole issue of testing, which seems to elicit the reaction of that fellow there on the screen. People get really nervous when we talk about testing when we're homeschoolers. So let's talk first of all about the purpose of testing. Why would we test anyway? What do you think?
Well, I think there's two different kinds of testing that we maybe need to define a little bit. One would be the standardized test, which some homeschoolers have to take because their state requires it and others don't. But that would be kind of the evaluation at the end of the year type. And then there's also the type that you would take as more of a regular basis, like, say, a math test or a science test or something like that. So mostly it's to measure progress.
But I think a lot of people need to realize that tests were developed in a classroom environment where a teacher had 20 or more students and needed a way to evaluate those students without taking the time to be one-on-one with them. When you're in the homeschool setting, you've got a little bit different situation and group dynamics, and so you don't necessarily have to use just the written test to be able to measure the progress.
That's a good point.
Right.
But I think there is some
child.
Right, exactly. Right. But I think there is some value to testing, certainly. I know we happen to live in a state where we are required to do the standardized testing, and, you know, as overwhelming and frightening as that sometimes may seem, I have found it to be an excellent way to identify for me the areas where my kids excel, where they do really well, and the areas where perhaps we need to work a little harder. And you know, usually as a mom, a homeschooling mom, you already know that because, like you said, Jill, you're talking with your kids and interacting with them. But sometimes I know I've been surprised to see on a standardized test that, oh, maybe, you know, over here is an area where we need to work a little harder this next year. So I think there is some value in testing for at least me as a teacher.
Well, you know, Judy, I live in a state that's really very hardly regulated at all. But I did standardized testing with my children, too. And sometimes we didn't do it every year because we weren't required. But I did it for exactly those same reasons, so that I could identify the strong and the weak areas so that the next year's curriculum, I could tweak it a little bit if I needed to focus on certain things for certain ones of my children.
Mm-hmm. Good point. So since you're talking about standardized testing there, Jill, let's talk a little bit about it. Does it have to be the big, scary, hairy monster that a lot of people make it?
I don't think it has to be, and a lot of times it depends where you take it, too. Like I know sometimes, and I don't know how you have to do it where you live, Judy, but where we live, a lot of times the homeschool group or co-op will do it. Sometimes kids test along with Christian schools. I was able to test my children at home. So sometimes the scariness is just the thought of going, say, wherever you have to go to take it. So if you can familiarize your child with that location, whatever it is, whether it's the library or the local church or wherever you're going, I think that would help. But I know with our kids, we always did those practice test-taking, I don't know, you can buy them from the company for maybe $8 or $10 or something, and it kind of has a practice test-taking. And not that we were trying to teach to the test, but it was to teach them how to take the test. And I think that's two different things. They would learn how to fill in those little bubbles and understand when they read the question what the process was of taking the test. So I think those practice test booklets, I guess they're called, that you can get are very helpful.
Good point.
And I think the note there that our attitude sets the tone is a big reflection. Just like with our little ones, when they fell down, and if the baby or the toddler fell over, a lot of times they would look up at you to say, "Okay, am I supposed to be crying or not?" And your reaction would set their tone. I think it's the same thing when you get to testing in school years, that if your attitude is positive, this is not something to be afraid of, we're just going to do this and just do what you can do your best, I'm not expecting the maximum, ace it all and everything, that set the tone for them. My boys actually thought that standardized testing was fun. They thought filling in all those bubbles was kind of a game. And so that was a very light time of the year for us, because it was a very different adjustment to, what we normally did in the day. And they could have fun with it.
I don't know about you guys, but I have at least one child that I've always called my why child. Everything that we did or anything I assigned, the question was always asked, "But why, Mom?" And so sometimes all it takes to reduce the scariness is just to explain why you're doing this. Answer that question. Why am I taking you to fill in all these little bubbles on this sheet of paper? And I think sometimes just sharing with them the purpose behind it helps to eliminate some of the unknown and the fear kind of aspect too. So we've talked about standardized testing a little bit. Let's kind of switch our focus here and talk about testing within a literature-based curriculum. Now, Sunlight's a literature-based curriculum, and we've already talked about the fact that we know what our kids are doing because we talk to them. So, why wouldn't a literature-based curriculum have built-in weekly or quarterly tests?
I'll let Kelly take this one.
Okay. I would say primarily because if you are continuing the discussion, if you are reading the stories with your children, talking to them about it, evaluating, asking them to narrate some of the story back to you, Dad asking questions at the dinner table, and getting feedback from them about what they have studied in the day, you are going to have a good grasp of their grasp of the information. You're going to be able to evaluate how much they're understanding, how much they can follow the flow of the story, and it's not going to be up to whether they can answer a question on the paper. But if they can explain it verbally and then help Dad understand what's going on when he's not been involved in the daily reading, then I think you can safely say they do understand and they are making progress.
Mm-hmm. I think also a lot of, especially with Sunlight, and you could do this with other curriculums as well, but as they get older, if they're writing, their creative writing, those type of things, if they reflect what they're learning in another subject like history or science, that shows really true comprehension too, because when you have a multiple choice test or true and false test, really, honestly, we all know you can take a lot of blind guesses there and kind of come out okay. You have a general idea of what's going on. But if they have to write, not necessarily like an essay test, but if they have to write, say, a weekly theme or even a paragraph for a younger child about something that they've just studied, that shows true comprehension. They have to think about it. They have to think about what the most important point of it is, why that thing happened or why it didn't happen or what they believe about it. That really shows a higher level of thinking than just checking off a true or false or multiple choice test.
And when you have to think about what you're learning that way, you mentioned the multiple choice test, Jill. I was really good when I was in school at memorizing information long enough to store it in my short-term memory so I could spit it back out on a test.
Yeah.
But if I had to write about something and I had to put that level of thought and preparation and into what I was producing, boy, did that stick with me a whole lot longer. So I think
it does.
Writing really drives the retention rate much, much higher. So I think that's a pretty good answer.
Uh-huh. And also the narration for younger child that couldn't write, just they're telling back, like Kelly said, telling Dad or telling you, it's the same process or idea. It's just for younger children, or for a more informal way, narration really is just as good as writing in a lot of situations.
Mm-hmm. Very good point. So what about this aspect of, I know I've talked to different customers and different folks who are considering homeschooling or homeschooling with a curriculum that doesn't have built-in regular testing. One of their concerns is, but what's my child going to do when they get to college? They won't know how to take a test. Have you guys ever run across that concern in talking with folks about homeschooling?
I've really heard that concern. Yeah, Kelly has too. I don't buy it. I think if a kid, and with my kids, I've seen it play out, that if they can think and they can listen and they can follow directions, they can take a test even if they've never taken one before. I mean, if you feel like they need some experience, I'm sure through the years, through their standardized tests, through maybe math tests, you might have a science test, they're going to have some idea of how to take a test. But I know with my kids, what I found was it kind of frustrated their college mates, because their college mates would be cramming for a test, like you said, Judy, trying to cram in that short-term memory, everything they really should have learned for the last 9 weeks. And my kids were like, well, I don't know, they weren't cramming for tests. They had never learned to cram for tests because we didn't really have tests. So what they learned was learn the material as you go along, and then they just took their test, and they always did well. I mean, not every single time maybe, but as well as anybody else did. Sometimes certain professors are tricky, but they did well because they learned the materials they went along, and they could read and think and follow directions. And I think really that's all you need.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any other responses, Kelly?
Well, I've had some ask, if you're following a literature-based curriculum that something like Sunlight, how well do your kids do on standardized tests? Because they're concerned that our scope and sequence may not match the scope and sequence for, a traditional textbook program or whatever. And that's generally what I tell them. Something similar to what Jill said is, if your child is learning to think, is learning to process the information, every standardized test is not built on the same scope and sequence, because there are multiples in the evaluation process. And so they really aren't going for a lot of fine detailed information. They're going for generalized information. And I found that my boys did fine on standardized testing because they learned to think.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And then they could present that, and even in a multiple choice, they could eliminate the answers that were not possibilities, and then make a chosen, a graduated, I'm losing the term, educated choice in what they used as their answer.
Good point.
I agree with that.
And I think sometimes, too, a lot of the fear about, what's going to happen once my student leaves my home in this area, it is just purely a lack of confidence, both on the parent-teacher's part and on the student's part. And I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. Your attitude sets the tone. If we spend most of our students' high school years bemoaning the fact that they don't have a lot of experience with test taking, then certainly they are going to leave our homeschool believing that they have no skills for taking a test. And so I think a lot of it, again, boils down to our attitude and our viewpoint and our perspective that we convey to them on the whole issue of test taking. So, we've covered pretty much some broad points about test taking here. Can you ladies think of anything else that we need to cover before we wrap up today?
I guess just to emphasize that really testing was all really developed by educational systems in order to see how a student, what they know. And if you know or have some idea of what your student knows, whether by writing what they've written, by their narration, by talking to them when you're doing the dishes together or sitting at the table, if you know that they've got comprehension, I don't think you need to be concerned about, but I don't have any formal tests, because they're learning, and that's really the ultimate thing of testing, is to just see if they're learning.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good point, Jill, and that is to think back and remember why tests were originally designed. And they were designed for a classroom because, just like we said earlier, teachers had no real good way of knowing how each of the 20 to 30 students in their room were actually doing on an individual basis, and this was a way to find out. So, good point. Very good point. So, ladies, again, thank you for joining me today. Hopefully we've been able to share a little bit of information that will perhaps make test-taking, whether standardized or on a regular basis, a little less scary prospect for folks. Thanks, ladies.
Thank you.
Judy.